Welcome to Don't Shout at the Telly with me, your host, Marisa Pereira. Today, we'll be discussing gay rights and progress, and we are delighted to have Jason Smith, Debating Matters Charges Coordinator and a freelance journalist. Jason, would you like to kick us off, please?
Thank you very much for having me, first of all. I don't know how much you all know about gay politics, but it's generally recognised to have started at the Stonewall bar in Christopher Street in New York in the summer of 1969, when, due to constant police raids and brutality, there ended up being a riot. And a year later, to mark that riot, there was, and what became known as an uprising, there was a march which became the first Gay Pride March, a very political march at the time, as opposed to gay pride marches today. The Gay Liberation Front was formed out of these events and quickly spread around the world, in Britain largely on university campuses across the country. Things have changed considerably since those times. It is acceptable to be gay now, and in fact being gay is almost celebrated as an aspect of our diverse society. And people are unlikely to face hostility. It's uncommon for someone to be kicked out of their home these days when they come out to their parents. It's very unlikely that they would be discriminated against in social housing, for instance. All areas that in the past people would have faced discrimination. In fact, Hillary Clinton announced that the US will use its aid budget to put pressure on countries where homosexuality is either illegal or where gays are persecuted. So things have really come on. At the same time, it's not usual outside of places like Soho in London for people to be able to, same-sex couples to be able to hold hands in the streets, or have have public displays of affection as heterosexual couples would take for granted. I think that's what is confusing for me, is how can those two situations exist at the same time? So on an international stage, homosexuality has almost been promoted around the world, and yet in the heart of a liberal society, it is still not normal, culturally normal, for public displays of homosexuality. And I guess I'm interested in the reasons why you think that's the case, as much as you might want to quiz me.
Well, maybe do you think it has something to do with the whole idea of tolerance? So maybe some people would think, if they are straight, or if they, oh, okay, it's fine, you can have your gay rights, I just don't want to see it, I don't want to hear about it. So I'll tolerate you, I won't stop you from practicing what you need to do, I just don't want to see it. Do you think that might be a reason?
I mean, there's two different things going on, and in terms of people not holding hands, there are obviously cultural shifts which need to go on in society for those kind of things to be acceptable, and sometimes those do lag behind. Although, generally, it is in the arena of culture that pushes boundaries, and not the other way around. It's not foreign policy generally that leads cultural change, it's cultural change that may lead foreign policy. I think it's still a confusing area, really.
Do you feel that groups, LGBT groups, do you feel that maybe they might be perpetuating the sense of exclusion and the sort of them and us mentality between gay people and non-gay people, straight people?
In terms of all of those LGBT sort of campaign groups, in that they're political at all anymore, whereas, as I say, at the beginning of the gay rights campaign that spread around in the 1970s, it was very much, they were really directly political. I mean, they were always a bit of an interesting bunch of organisations anyway, in that they came out of two things. One was a disillusionment with the left, who at the time thought of campaigns for homosexuality as a bourgeois deviation, and also a dissatisfaction with the countercultural groups of the 1960s, with the hippies, where free love was considered very much a heterosexual thing and really didn't expand to homosexuals. There's all sorts of literature written on how hippies, despite free love, were just as anti-gay as the rest of society at the time. So in one sense you can see the differences between those groups from now and in the past, but mainly all of their energy over the past 5 or 10 years particularly has gone into the issue of gay marriage. So that particular issue can't be causing division because, you know, marriage is a is not a minority pursuit, is it?
From what was said earlier by Hillary Clinton and David Cameron, in terms of aid being cut on third world countries that refuse to grant gay rights, I think that's the wrong approach to it, because that would actually bring up more opposition, because to implement a long-lasting policy, you must do that with care and caution. You cannot enforce that by cutting aid. I think that would just make the government more resistant. I think the best way to do that is to send in non-governmental organisations and to send in lobbyists to Parliament to explain the issues. I think that's the quickest way they can start to get an understanding of the issues and then implement them later on. But to cut aid will just cause more problems, and then there'll be more hatred towards gays because there'll be less aid coming in, so everyone will just find someone to blame for that.
I disagree. I think it's up to the gays in those countries to fight and to debate, rather than being a policy imposed by the state or by Hillary Clinton trying to persuade those governments to be, you know, pro-gay. So I disagree with your point in that sense.
And would that actually work if a foreign power was coming into a country and saying, oh, well, we know better than you, this is how we think you should run your country, so get on with it, do what we think. I think that also, as well as cutting aid, I think that would be another way of increasing resentment towards the gay community, because maybe there'd be a sense of, oh, well, because of you lot, we've now got foreigners coming into this country telling us what to do, and it's because of the gay community that we now don't have sovereignty.
I agree with a lot of the points that you make. I do wonder, though, that with the point about NGOs and going into countries, that would be a better way than governments. I mean, I think the one thing about NGOs is that they pretty much pursue a government agenda, a government-backed agenda. So you can sort of ask, well, actually, what's the difference between an NGO and direct intervention into a country by another one? But also, I think an interesting question is that actually, what is wrong with a country saying that, okay, these are our values, these are things that we value as a society. If they're then giving aid to another country, what's wrong with saying, well, we're not going to give it to countries that have got views that we don't agree with? I mean, isn't that their right in a way? Are we saying that those things that happened in 1969 in New York and the development of a gay rights movement, are we saying that that's a unique event that couldn't possibly happen in Uganda or Nigeria spontaneously by people within those countries itself? You know, it needs a sort of liberal Western mindset to force those things to happen. That these darkies are incapable of doing it for themselves is effectively, I think, what US foreign policy is saying there.
I think you're absolutely right there, because as you said before, cultural change happens not because of a policy that's implemented, it's policies that follow cultural change, so it can happen absolutely anywhere. It's not up to us to decide and be paternalistic about it. I mean, yeah.
In those countries, it's up to the gay people to bring up their demand, and because it should come from the bottom and go to the state, and the state could be able to translate this demand. It's not the contrary. So, for example, in France, in 2004, a mayor celebrated a gay marriage, and later in 2007, the justice just cancelled this, saying that it was not legal. Similarly for adoption, that in 2001, a woman had been allowed to adopt the child of her partner, and then similarly in 2007 the justice decided that it wasn't legal. So it seems like the society is moving faster than the state. Perhaps the state can be trusted to make decisions or to speak for people.
I think it's always problematic to see the state as the arena in which the idea almost being that today particularly is that the way that you fight for rights is that you make demands of the state to hand things down to you. That it's the state who will bring about equality by handing the goodies down from on high, kind of thing. Now, throughout history, that has never been the case. People have won concessions from the state through violent protest most of the time. And what's interesting and what's changed now is that people don't view the state in the same way. That the state is viewed as this sort of fluffy type of place that has all our best interests at heart, and I'd really question that. So yes, I really like your point. I think you're right.
Talking about the whole debate in a lot of the African countries. And about how maybe we're not giving them, or the gay people there, credit enough to say, oh, you can come and stand up and fight for your rights. I don't see it quite like that, and going back to what you were just saying as well, because a lot of the opposition to gay rights in that country is from a bottom-up position. You know, it is people, it is a community who are standing up saying, these are our morals, this is not what we want in our society. So in fact, what you're saying is what they're doing.
Yeah, but they have to persuade the majority about their position in society.
But the majority is against. Do you see what I'm saying? So
but they have to win the argument on by debating with them. The state can't say to the majority, you can't say that because we're going to protect the minority.
We need to realise that in third world countries, democracy is still quite a foreign concept. So whereas in the West you might have a protest and there'll be groups and the government would listen. In third world countries, especially in countries in Africa, they could just all be killed by protesting and there would be nothing achieved then. Because the majority are so set on the views that they have and it's tied to religion and it's tied to values, it makes it quite difficult. Whereas if it was a thing whereby everyone was sort of understanding of it, they could reach somewhere. I'm not saying that the protests will not work, but I'm just saying that as long as the values remain the same, and they're quite valid values as well, it would be quite difficult. So I think we just need to educate people more to understand both sides of the argument first.
Values change naturally. It's not something that remains static over time. You don't need to have sort of intervention to change, a country's values from outside. It changes with time, and I think you could trust them enough to get on with it.
I mean, I think to a certain extent that's right, but it doesn't change just with time, does it? I mean, there needs to be some kind of catalyst, and the values that you're talking about of people in Africa were absolutely the values of people in Britain in the 1950s. And, until the 60s when British society started changing, until the early 50s, it was against the law to be gay here, as it is in places in Africa now. It wasn't until those sort of the social progress movements of the 1960s that people's views changed and developed.
I think the ultimate ideal of equality is that for everyone to accept everyone else, not because they've been told to by a law or by a state, but because they want to and because they feel it's maybe not because it's the right thing to do, just because they want to. No one's told them that you should like other people, just they want to anyway.
And you never know when you're going to be the minority. So.
Does any of it really matter? Because we do have there are differences, but at the end of the day, are they so important that we can't live with other people in the same society? I mean, it could get to the point of like, oh, well, that person likes green, but I think blue's way better, so I'm going to kill them. It's just emphasising human difference instead of the fact that actually we're all human, we can all find points of similarity and live together, I think would be more important than the fact that we also have some differences. So maybe that's why we accept minorities, because actually minority, I don't think human beings are a minority. It's quite a lot of us around, and I think that's, you know, probably more important than a few minor differences.
I think it comes back to your point about cultural change and the fact that you might see the problem as the majority of people in some places. It's perfectly possible for somebody to be anti-gay, but it would still be within their interests for people to have a full extension of rights, because it's in all of our interests. So it's not about a sort of fluffy, let's all be nice to each other, you prefer red, I prefer blue. It's actually about what's in your direct interests, whether you're in favour of gay marriage or not, because we all have an interest in everybody being as free and as equal as possible. Because if we accept that a certain section of society is somehow below us and that those rights are somehow not applicable to them, then we're all belittled by that.
Do you think that the people's prejudice against gay people tends to be because of this general view that society is breaking down in some way, and the breakdown of the nuclear family and the traditional family unit?
I want to pose it slightly differently, I think, because I don't think there is prejudice against gay people. I haven't known any for the whole of my life, really, and I'm 40. You might get instances of their, particular, very unusual cases, and I think that's why they spring up in your mind of, violence against an individual walking through a park at night, that kind of thing, and they're pushed as anti-gay violence in the media. Because on the one hand, everybody's liberal, and everybody's very accepting, and there's really no problem. On the other hand, people will talk about prejudice in the way that you have, and I think the idea is that, everybody's very fluffy on the surface, but behind their backs, everybody's got a baseball bat that they're about to wield any moment that somebody's not looking, and their real nature, their anti-gayness will sort of come out. It really suggests looking down on and having an incredibly bad opinion about our fellow citizens, our fellow human beings, that there is all of this prejudice behind there just lurking, waiting to get out. I don't see it, and I've never experienced it.
What about sort of more institutionalized prejudice, like maybe blocks to gay couples either fostering or adopting, or, an example that's already been mentioned, having access to the institution of marriage? What to do about those kinds of blocks to progression?
Marriage in the sense of civil partnerships has obviously come in. There's an equal age of consent, and there are those rights now.
The legislation is in place that allows adoption. I have heard stories of people recently where gay couples have had trouble adopting because they are gay, and I think there are still prejudices within, although you're still allowed to, people still have that sort of ability to decide and differentiate, and therefore prejudice can still come through.
Well, the big case that came up relatively recently was a couple who've offered respite foster care, and they were a Christian couple. They were saying that it wouldn't be acceptable for the child it's a teenager, to be having sex under their roof because they're a Christian couple and they don't agree with homosexuality. At the same time, they were completely willing to offer the child respite care. So it wasn't really that they're anti-gay. That's what was made out of it in the press. And there was a big debate about religion and not adopting in this case, but it was the same kind of discussion and offering foster care. And I suppose what I'd say is that what's the problem with a child who, or a teenager who is experimenting with their sexuality, which is a completely normal thing for everybody to do, or who thinks they might be gay? What's the problem with them being placed with somebody who thinks homosexuality is wrong? I mean, most people of my generation, their parents would have thought that if their child came out, they wouldn't have been happy about it. But, you know, does that mean that everybody grew up as, you know, with sort of psychological disorders and completely awful adults because of that experience? No, right? That was just reality of the society, in the same way that in the 60s and 70s, black people had to put up with racism being completely normal. Does that mean that we were all incapable of growing up to be normal people? No, that was just life. Well, you know, you get over it, don't you?
Does a foster parent who isn't on the same level as a parent who loves their child and will love them, you know, for the rest of their lives, do they have a right to have that sort of conversation with a foster child, not under my roof or anything like that? I just wanted to highlight the difference between a parent who actually loves their kids and a foster parent who is just in the place of a real parent.
I think, first of all, the idea that somebody should be disqualified from doing something because they have a particular set of views is really problematic. It's saying that there are an acceptable set of state-sanctioned opinions which you are allowed to have if you want to do particular things in the world. And if you don't have these views which we've agreed are acceptable, then you can't do these things. Who is it for the state to tell you what's your opinion? I would say. Also, I think what that speaks to is the idea that people are vulnerable and incapable of dealing with life unless they're mollycoddled. That if you're a minority, then you have to have, there has to be a specific set of circumstances in which you're allowed to thrive. Well, I think, you know, life throws all sorts of things at you, and all of those things make you who you are.
I know that in Italy, inside the left wing, there are a lot of Catholic vision, and because in Italy we have the Catholic Church and the Pope, and this, and I want to know what do you think about this? If it's a problem.
It's not just in Italy. I think around the country that got, you know, a big the church could be Christian, Catholic, or Muslim, just have a lot of power.
Do you think religion affects it that much? Because in America there's a separation of church and state, but they still haven't got that far in implementing gay rights. So does religion really play that bigger part, or is it just people's opinions?
I think, especially in the States, although technically religion and state are separate, the leading people or powers of the United States are still very religious. I don't think there's ever been a non-Christian president, and those values affect a lot of the country. So even though technically the state and religion are different, say the church, they're still going to be affected by that, and they know that a lot of the people who vote for them will be more appealed by something that relates to them.
But the church is a force within society. It's a particular force within Italian society, although maybe I think probably a dwindling one. Have they not got rights to have political views of their own?
I think they should be allowed their own rights and their own political views, but within their own society, within their own section. So what they think shouldn't have an effect on other areas of law, society.
I don't know so much about the situation in Italy, but in Britain certainly. The whole issue of gay rights and that sort of accepted liberal agenda is really being used to attack the authority of the church. And you might say, well, you know, I'm not religious, I don't particularly care about the church, but it's not really the church that's important. It's more about having, you know, whether you allow people to group together and form a society or a club or a church or whatever it is, and say that these are our values, and you can join if you agree with those values. And it seems to me that it's an attack on people's ability to form organisations where they decide what their principles are.
Yeah, I'd just like to contest your point when you said homophobia is not an issue anymore. I think it is still an issue because otherwise people wouldn't be talking about it still openly. I would also argue that any kind of like intolerance that would incite hate, I would be intolerant of, because I believe that hate and hate speech would incite hatred and hatred acts, and it could endanger people.
I think ultimately there has to be a certain level of intolerance towards intolerance, because otherwise it will get to the far end of the spectrum, which is people will be allowed to kill someone else because they don't agree with them. There has to be a certain level where you say, okay, you need to stop now because you're endangering someone else. But I don't like that fact, but people will be allowed to get away with it. I mean, that's the whole point about living in society, is someone has to say and has to enforce the view that you can't say that, or even, maybe not you can't say that because free speech is a right, but you can't do that because you're harming someone else. That's when I think intolerance of intolerance is acceptable, but it's a grey area, it's not black and white. You can't just say intolerance of intolerance is wrong, full stop, and you neither can say tolerance of intolerance is correct. There has to be a grey area. That's why we're here debating it.
You said that you don't feel that homophobia is a problem anymore for homosexuals because you've never experienced it in your life. However, that's just one life, you're one person, so why do you think you can speak for the entire gay community in England? That's one thing I have to say. And also on the tolerance issue that we've been covering, is it that we're okay with free speech, so we can say the most hateful things and that's okay? But right now, are you guys trying to draw the line between saying something heinous and doing something heinous? Because I agree that, yeah, if someone's torn apart for being gay, yeah, the people who did that need to go to prison. But if you say, oh, gay people should be torn apart, well, you can't go to prison, because isn't that just free speech? But there's a difference between saying something and doing it.
A really bad example of how intolerance is damaging society at the moment is this new idea of reporting kids every time they use the word gay. I mean, first of all, kids, the meaning of gay for kids is completely different of the meaning we adults, know. So I would like to point out that, this is actually really, really bad.
I think it's fantastic you've never come across homophobia really, or proper prejudice. I think that's great, but my mind's immediately coming up with situation after situation, and maybe not necessarily in the UK, and this is where it's kind of really struggled. I think the whole conversation struggled because I'm sure we've each got our own idea of what communities we're thinking of when we're having this discussion. I know we've kind of highlighted it a little bit, but so is homophobia a problem? Have we progressed? Have we, where is it? Where are we talking about? Because I'm sure there are places where the points you're making are completely valid. That let people have this point of view, let people do this. I'm sure that I do agree with that. But I think there are also places, and I've been in places where it is not like that. And unless you can say it's only because of Stonewall, it's only because of this, and it's got nothing to do with anything legal that's come into place, that England is, or the communities you've been in, have got to this stage, then that's the only way I can buy that argument, if that makes sense. Because surely there has been a role for not only community and not only bottom down action, but top down action as well.
If it's such a non-issue, I mean, homophobia is not an issue anymore, or we've progressed so much in gay rights, why is it still being pushed as sort of, it is a problem, it needs to be fought and whatever? Why is that? And is it because of, I read this article somewhere, I can't remember who, they were talking about the government trying to separate themselves from the ordinary person who is against, homosexuality, and they're sort of creating the moral high ground that if you're against it, then you're a terrible person and you're a monster and you're this. So we're giving the moral high ground here, and that's why it's still being pushed. If as you say, it's such a non-issue.
I think you hit the nail on the head, really, that there is a difference between speech and action. And it's a very important one, and if you blur the distinction, which is happening all the time, And it's saying that because speech might lead somewhere, it might end up having serious bad consequences, then we have to stop the speech. The underlying problem of that to me is that that's saying that if you hear something which is derogatory towards a particular group, then you're not a thinking person that can work out what's the right response to that yourself. You're just going to go off, take that literally, and go and beat somebody up because of it. Beating somebody up, hurting them and putting them in the hospital is likely to land you up in court and in prison. Your point that there are places around the world where you could, where certainly discrimination still takes place. I think the point is, how do you, what is it that you do to be able to combat that discrimination? And I'd say that that has to come from a point I made earlier, from people's self-interest. We all have a self-interest in everybody in society being equal, because if we're not, that belittles all of us. So in terms of how you might go about doing something about homophobia or prejudice, then that's really down to you and the circle of friends that you're in to do something about that, or more broadly, to set up an organisation in society and do something actually about it. To look to the state, I think, misunderstands the role of the state in society, and you might want to argue that the state can be progressive. In certain circumstances I might agree with you. The majority of the time I would absolutely disagree with you. I think it's, if you look at protest movements throughout history, whether it be from the suffragettes, Malcolm X, or those sort of movements in America, equality is not something which is handed down on a plate from on high. It's something that people fight for. It's an aspiration that stems from the depths of society. If you look for somebody to hand something down for you, then I think you're saying something about yourself as an incapable individual. In terms of the focus on prejudice, which the discussions in society focus on and we've also focused on, I think it says a lot about our current society. The lack of any real values around which everyone can gather. So, for instance, being in favour of gay rights is considered the height of liberal virtue. Being racist is completely unacceptable, because we have to tolerate difference, but we don't tolerate differences that don't fit into those liberal values. So you have to ask, how tolerant is it? So the being tolerant of intolerant people is absolutely the right question, but I think we're confusing two different understandings of what tolerance is. So on the one hand you have tolerance that I think we're talking about it as non-judgmentalism. So the more tolerant you are, the less you have to say about someone else's life and beliefs, because you're just tolerant of them, you're non-judgmental. So that has the effect of closing down discussion, because how can you start a discussion or maybe an argument with somebody with something that you're supposedly completely non-judgmental over? The other view of tolerance is an acceptance that everyone is different, and that you take other people seriously by arguing with them on the things that you disagree with. And how does society develop and move forward in its ideas unless you take people seriously? So I don't think it's a problem that there are people who express anti-gay views in society. I personally might want to have a row with them, but the very act of having a row with them means I'm taking their views seriously. I'm not dismissing them. I'm not pushing those views under the carpet. I'm not being non-judgmental. I'm being very judgmental in that I'm saying I completely disagree with you. But the way that tolerance is viewed today means that discussion is just completely closed down, and we don't have those debates, which I think is really problematic. I think because the main virtue of society has become non-judgmentalist, then it means that people are looking around for instances of bigotry constantly, whether they exist or not. So anything these days is redefined as anti-gay bullying in schools, for instance, that came up, and yet that gets blown up out of all proportion. And so people have get this idea that there is prejudice all around the place, and I just think in reality that's not the case.
Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. Thank you, Jason, for the fantastic debate. If you would like to take part in a future Don't Shout at the Telly, please email us at WORLDwrite and leave your comment below.